commercial diving stands as one of the most perilous professions on the face of the planet, a vocation where the ever-present nightmare of being crushed beneath the immense, unrelenting weight of hundreds upon hundreds of feet of cold, dark ocean water lingers like a constant shadow in the mind of every man who straps on his gear and descends into the abyss. These brave souls place their very lives in the hands of a single, deceptively fragile lifeline, an umbilical cord that snakes its way from the surface down to their position, supplying them with the breathable gases, warmth, communications, and power they need to survive in an environment that is utterly hostile to human life. When the integrity of this critical link is suddenly placed in jeopardy, when it frays, snaps, or fails under the colossal forces at play, the consequences unfold with devastating speed and finality, often proving fatal in the most unforgiving ways imaginable. This is the gripping, heart-wrenching true story of the Wildrake Diving Accident, a catastrophic chain of events that unfolded in the North Sea and exposed the deadly intersection of haste, flawed engineering, reckless decision-making, and overlooked safety protocols that ultimately claimed the lives of two dedicated professional divers. Back in the late 1970s, the company known as Wildrake Diving Services had just landed a high-stakes contract to carry out essential repair work on an oil transfer station located in the notoriously rough and unpredictable waters of the North Sea. As a commercial diving operation that was still relatively young and ambitious, Wildrake had recently taken possession of a brand-new, purpose-built diving vessel called the Wildrake. The ship represented the cutting edge of saturation diving technology at the time, but in their eagerness to meet the tight deadlines of the contract, the final manufacturing details were still being hurriedly completed even as the vessel was being rushed out to sea to begin operations without the luxury of full testing or refinement. The specific task at hand involved reinstalling a riser pipe and a specialized filling station for a major oil platform situated in the Thistle oil field. This filling station went by the technical name of a single anchor leg mooring, or SALM for short, and it served a vital purpose. It allowed large tankers to pull up and moor at a safe distance from the main platform itself while loading up with oil, thereby minimizing risks in the constantly shifting and storm-prone offshore environment where waves and currents could turn even routine operations into life-threatening challenges. At the heart of the operation was a sophisticated saturation diving system that included a specially designed diving bell capable of transporting two divers at a time down to the extreme depths required for the intricate work of welding, fitting, and meticulously repairing the various components of the SALM structure. This bell was engineered to be pressurized internally to precisely match the crushing external pressure of the seawater at depth, allowing the divers to exit the bell, perform their physically demanding tasks on the seafloor, and then return inside for rest and recovery without having to endure the exhausting and time-consuming decompression process after every single shift. The Wildrake itself was outfitted with a complete saturation diving setup, featuring the bell connected directly to two separate living chambers. This clever configuration enabled as many as 6 divers to remain under continuous high pressure for extended periods. Specifically, 28 full days at a stretch in this particular job, while working in rotating shifts to complete the contracted repairs. The system brilliantly bypassed the lengthy, multi-day decompression schedules that would otherwise cripple productivity in such deep water projects. To fully appreciate the brilliance and necessity of saturation diving, one must contrast it with the far simpler world of recreational scuba diving. In recreational scenarios, a diver might descend for a brief 10 minutes or so at a deeper depth, then ascend slowly with mandatory safety stops at several intermediate depths. These stops allow the inert gases that have been forced into the bloodstream under pressure to slowly and safely diffuse out of the body, preventing the formation of dangerous bubbles. If a diver returns to shallower waters too quickly, those gases can come out of solution abruptly, creating painful and debilitating air bubbles throughout the body, a condition known as decompression sickness or the bends, which in extreme cases can lead to permanent injury or even death. Commercial divers, however, face an entirely different reality. They must remain at great depths for long, grueling stretches of time to finish complex underwater construction or repair projects. Saturation diving offers an ingenious solution by keeping the divers' bodies fully saturated with the breathing gas mixture at a consistent high pressure for weeks on end. This way, they can work efficiently in shifts without the need for repeated, lengthy decompressions, which would otherwise make such jobs commercially unfeasible for the companies involved. Aboard the Wildrake, the diving bell was securely linked to the 2 living chambers, creating a pressurized habitat where the 6-man team could eat, sleep, and rest in relative safety, while 2 of their colleagues ventured out in the bell for active work shifts. The living quarters were undeniably cramped and claustrophobic, with limited space for movement or personal comfort, Yet the exceptionally high pay rates made the sacrifices more than worthwhile for these men, many of whom were supporting wives, children, and extended families back on dry land. Separate teams of highly trained personnel remained on constant duty, meticulously monitoring every aspect of the saturation chambers, including air quality, precise temperature control, and internal pressure levels, while another dedicated group oversaw the Bell's launch, operation, and recovery. Although every individual on the ship confronted the same overarching dangers inherent to working in such an extreme high-pressure environment, the two men inside the Bell at any given moment faced additional layers of isolation and peril. They operated alone in near-total darkness nearly 500 feet beneath the surface, entirely dependent on the thin umbilical cord for their continued existence, with no immediate help if something went catastrophically wrong. By the time August 1979 rolled around, the Wildrake had already been actively engaged on the Thistlefield project for nearly a full month. During that period, the crew had successfully executed 29 separate Bell dives, methodically tackling and completing a wide variety of connection points, installations, and repairs on the SALM system. The current saturation team consisted of 6 experienced divers: Richard Walker, Skip Gell, Len, Dave Mitchell, Roger Palmer, and Dave Boyd. They had only just begun their own 28-day saturation schedule and were on the 9th day of their rotation when the unthinkable began to unfold. Their immediate task was to maneuver the newly completed SALM unit into its final position right beside the massive Thistle platform and then securely attach it to the prepared base structure. When the previous saturation crew had finally come out of their long decompression and surfaced, they had taken the time to brief the incoming team in detail about a number of unexpected issues and challenges they had encountered with the brand new chamber and Bell system. Those earlier 17 dives had served as the very first operational tests for this unproven vessel, revealing several design shortcomings, equipment limitations, and procedural mistakes that now had to be carefully managed by the fresh team. One of the most immediately noticeable problems concerned the diving Bell's launching mechanism. It simply could not be lifted cleanly into its designated cradle on the ship because the swivel connector attached to the main lift wire proved to be far too long for the available space. In what should have been a fundamental and obvious design standard that any experienced naval architect would have caught during the planning stages, this oversight created an impasse. Rather than postpone the entire high-value contract and return the ship to port for proper modifications, the owner of Infabco, Brian Masterson, made the call to implement a quick and dirty workaround. He ordered the swivel to be completely removed from the lift wire and replaced with 2 ordinary shackles to reconnect the components. While this improvisation did solve the immediate fit problem and allowed the Bell to be launched, it was a poor and inadequate substitute for the smooth, load-bearing swivel action that the original engineering had intended. The shackles now had to absorb unnatural levels of torque and sudden impacts that they were never rated to handle, creating hidden stresses that would later prove disastrous. Nevertheless, the team entered saturation with a measured sense of confidence, placing their faith in the surface support crews and the belief that any remaining issues would be handled responsibly. The night of August 7, 1979, began routinely enough for the 2 divers assigned to the next Bell shift. At precisely 11 o'clock in the evening, Richard Walker and Skip Gell began suiting up inside the living chambers, carefully donning their specialized hot water suits. These suits were far more than simple diving apparel. They formed an essential lifeline component, with multiple tubes integrated into the umbilical cord that continuously circulated heated water across the divers' bodies to counteract the freezing 40-degree Fahrenheit temperatures of the North Sea waters. Without this constant flow of warmth, hypothermia could set in with terrifying rapidity. The umbilical itself was an incredibly complex bundle of life-sustaining conduits. It carried the precise breathing gas mixture tailored for the high-pressure environment, electrical power for lights and tools, communications cables, depth gauges, and even video transmission lines that allowed the surface team to monitor the work in real time. The Bell itself featured an advanced double-door sealing system designed to allow the internal pressure to be raised or lowered as needed to perfectly match the external depth, ensuring that the hatches could be opened underwater without any risk of flooding the interior with seawater. At 11:40 that night, Richard slipped out of the Bell and into the inky blackness of the ocean, immediately beginning his assigned tasks with the practiced efficiency of a seasoned professional. He worked steadily through his checklist, eventually picking up the underwater video camera to provide live footage of the SALM base back to the dive superintendent watching intently on the ship above. After completing several careful passes with the camera to document the area, he turned to make his way back toward the Bell. only to experience a moment of disorienting confusion that quickly sharpened into stark alarm. The bell had dropped noticeably closer to the seafloor and was now hanging at a dangerous 45-degree angle, its position visibly compromised. Without wasting a single second, Richard swung the camera around to capture the alarming sight for the topside team and swam urgently back toward the bell, fully aware that he needed to get inside before the situation deteriorated any further. One of the bell's most glaring and unusual design flaws now became horrifyingly apparent. There was no protective frame, no stabilizing legs or skids whatsoever to hold the bell elevated off the sandy bottom if it ever had to be set down. Should the bell come to rest fully on the seabed, the outer hatch door would be pressed flush against the sediment, rendering it completely impossible to open or operate. Inside the bell, Skip Gell had already sensed the sudden descent and was working with frantic precision to crack open the gas valve, steadily increasing the internal pressure to counteract the drop of 25 feet and prevent seawater from rising any higher up the entry trunk. Icy water was already beginning to creep menacingly upward. By 2:45 in the morning, Richard had successfully reached the bell, climbed the trunk with urgent determination, and pulled the inner door firmly closed behind him. The two men huddled together, trying to make sense of the unfolding chaos and piece together exactly what had gone wrong in those critical moments. Meanwhile, high above on the Wildrake's deck, the Bell operations team was coming to the same devastating realization. The primary lift wire had completely broken and parted, leaving the entire bell suspended precariously by nothing more than its umbilical cord. The video screen had gone abruptly black, and all communications from below had fallen into an eerie, static-filled silence. To compound the crisis, yet another hidden design flaw from the ship's rushed construction now revealed itself in spectacular and dangerous fashion. Hot water began spewing violently across the deck from the umbilical line, creating a chaotic spray that soaked equipment and crew alike. This problem had first surfaced several weeks earlier when the internal hot water tubing had cracked and sheared apart under the constant kinking, folding, and twisting forces exerted on the umbilical during normal operations, simply because the wrong grade of flexible tubing had been installed during manufacturing. The crew had attempted to patch the issue by routing an entirely new hot water supply line along the outside of the main umbilical and securing it with nothing more than heavy tape. When the lift wire had snapped, the instantaneous and violent jerk on the umbilical had caused this makeshift external line to rupture as well. Communications were now completely severed. The supply of life-giving hot water was rapidly diminishing, yet miraculously the main breathing gas line and the internal depth gauges continued to function. Inside the bell, Richard and Skip had already increased the internal pressure to seal the door tightly, creating a temporarily stable sanctuary with sufficient air reserves and emergency tanks still intact. In the world of commercial diving, strict international regulations required every vessel to maintain both a primary and a fully functional secondary method of bell recovery at all times. The Wildrake's secondary system, the innovative clump weight recovery mechanism, had unfortunately been deliberately disabled and removed just a few short weeks before the ship entered service. The original design had called for the bell to be launched and recovered through a moon pool opening in the center of the deck, but the engineers had clearly lacked practical experience with the violent storms and heavy seas typical of the North Sea. When attempting to launch over the side using the davit crane system instead, the heavy clump weight and its accompanying guide wires could not clear the ship's deck railing without risk of collision or entanglement. Rather than redesign or modify the system to address this critical safety shortfall, the crew had simply elected to remove the entire clump weight assembly altogether. This left them with no reliable backup plan should the primary lift wire ever fail. Now, with Richard and Skip safely locked inside the bell but dangling helplessly with no lift wire and no clump weight available, the surface team entered a state of frantic discussion over the limited options remaining. The two divers inside the bell adhered strictly to emergency protocols, remaining as calm as humanly possible under the circumstances. They continued attempting to transmit messages via the radio despite hearing only static in return. The air supply remained steady and the residual hot water still flowed, however weakly, so they focused on conserving energy and waiting for the surface crew to execute a proper recovery. Then, without warning, they felt a sharp, violent jerking motion, followed by another. Skip immediately began yelling desperately into the communications unit, repeating the urgent plea over and over, "Put us on the bottom! Put us on the bottom!" He had no way of knowing whether his words were getting through, but he understood with crystal clarity that their only remaining lifeline, the umbilical cord itself, could never safely bear the full weight of the bell as a lifting device. On the deck of the Wildrake, Dive Superintendent Holmes found himself under almost unbearable professional and personal pressure to devise a swift solution. The safest and most logical course of action would have been to gently lower the bell all the way to the seabed in order to relieve the dangerous tension on the umbilical, then immediately summon assistance from another nearby diving vessel to send its own team of divers down to reattach a proper lift wire to the top of the Wildrake bell. At precisely 2:57 in the morning, contact was made with the nearest available ship, the Stina Welder, and they were asked to stand by for possible assistance without full details being shared. Yet, in a decision that would later be heavily criticized, Masterson and Holmes elected instead to attempt an emergency recovery using the umbilical cord itself, placing blind faith in the manufacturer's untested claims that the hydraulic lines could somehow handle the extraordinary load despite the recent and very public failure of the hot water tubing. The owner, Brian Masterson, consulted briefly with his most experienced dive operations personnel, but the pressure to resolve the situation quickly without outside help apparently overrode caution. During this tense period, deck crew members were frantically attempting to repair the damaged hot water line in order to stem the massive loss, but their efforts were abruptly halted when the order came down to activate the hydraulic motor on the umbilical winch. The men on deck were stunned and deeply alarmed by the directive, yet they felt they had no real authority to challenge the owner and the superintendent in the heat of the moment. The umbilical began pulling taut and wrapping around the wheel with alarming speed, only for the stop command to be issued moments later as the line started splitting open catastrophically. Individual wires and tubes were now jamming violently into the side of the winch like some nightmarish meat grinder, with hot water spraying everywhere in chaotic jets. This horrifying development should have served as the definitive signal to abandon the umbilical recovery attempt immediately and call in the Stina Welder for professional assistance. Instead, Masterson remained determined to press forward, now ordering the ship's deck crane to be used in yet another attempt to haul the bell upward using the compromised umbilical. The second effort met with equally swift and terrifying failure. Not only did the umbilical continue to split apart, but entire sections of tubing and wiring began snapping and popping free with audible, sickening cracks. In the midst of this chaos, a faint and strained transmission finally broke through the static from inside the bell. Skip's repeated pleas to set the bell on the seabed had at last been heard. By 3:45 in the morning, the umbilical had suffered such severe damage that only two critical lines remained intact and functional: the main breathing gas supply and the topside reading for the bell's internal depth gauge. The hot water line was now completely severed, and hypothermia loomed as the most immediate and deadly threat to the men trapped below. Following established emergency procedures to the letter, Richard and Skip opened their survival kits and wrapped themselves in the thin foil blankets provided, blankets that offered far less protection than the full-body insulated suits they had been expecting in such a dire scenario. At 4 o'clock in the morning, the Stina Welder was finally formally requested to join the rescue effort in earnest. Coordination between the two vessels involved lengthy back-and-forth radio exchanges regarding equipment, procedures, and positioning, but by 5:45, two highly experienced Stina Welder divers, Eddie Frank and Phil Casey, were descending in their own bell toward the disaster site, ready to lend their expertise. Masterson, however, made yet another controversial and ultimately fateful decision. Rather than permitting the Stina Welder crew to perform the lift themselves from their ideal position directly overhead, he insisted that they first attach the Wildrake's own lift wire so that his team could claim the rescue. This forced the Wildrake to attempt recovery at a dangerous 45-degree angle from its current position, an approach that flew in the face of every established best practice and safety standard in the entire commercial diving industry. The superintendent aboard the Stina Welder voiced strong objections, recognizing the reckless nature of the plan, but Masterson, primarily a businessman with limited first-hand diving experience, refused to yield. The Stina Welder's bell reached the approximate target coordinates, but the rescue team immediately encountered a series of frustrating obstacles that would waste precious time. The Wildrake crew had inadvertently provided outdated location data, having forgotten to update the coordinates after moving the bell away from the SALM base several hours earlier. Making the situation even worse, the Wildrake bell's underwater transponder beacon, which had been reliably used during all 29 previous dives for precise locating, had come loose and detached the night before as the bell was being lowered. Instead of taking the time to haul the bell back up and properly reattach the critical device, the deckhands had been ordered simply to cut it away in order to save time and get the operation moving again. Now, in the midst of a genuine life-or-death emergency where every minute counted, Frank and Casey were forced to conduct a wide, laborious search pattern around their own bell in near-total darkness. Compounding their difficulties, the Stena welder's own external bell lights and diver-to-bell communication systems were still out of service due to ongoing repairs that had been underway just before the emergency call came in. This made the entire operation extraordinarily cumbersome, physically exhausting, and inherently dangerous for the rescue divers. At 6:44 in the morning, Phil Casey finally entered the water and began his painstaking search. More than an hour of grueling effort passed before he located the Wildrake bell. At 7:55 a.m., he rapped sharply on the porthole with the handle of his knife. Inside, he was profoundly relieved to witness frantic movement, the appearance of a human face pressed against the glass, and two enthusiastic thumbs-up signals. The men were confirmed to be alive, conscious, and responsive despite the ordeal. Unbeknownst to the rescuers at that moment, Richard and Skip had already endured more than 3 hours of complete isolation and radio silence following the loss of communications. The cold had begun its slow, insidious assault on their bodies. After carefully reviewing every possible option available to them, the two divers had reluctantly decided to resort to their absolute last emergency measure, releasing the bell's drop weights to trigger a rapid buoyant ascent to the surface. These heavy weights were normally attached to the exterior of the bell to counteract its natural buoyancy as a large air-filled chamber. Dropping them would allow the bell to rocket upward, but only if both men were securely locked inside with the hatches sealed and internal pressure carefully controlled. Any mistake here would mean certain death. Recent tragic accidents involving accidental or premature release of these weights had left the diving community shaken, prompting the Wildrake crew to add an extra layer of safety by tying the weights down with strong nylon ropes. Unfortunately, this modification meant that a diver would have to exit the bell and physically cut the ropes before the release mechanism could be activated. An impossible task if the bell was already resting on the seabed. Because of the slight tilt caused by the uneven bottom, Richard was able to contort his body painfully through the trunk opening and reach around the sharp metal edges with his knife, slicing his arms in the process but successfully freeing one of the two drop weights. The second weight, however, remained completely unreachable due to the awkward angle and the position of the outer door hinges. They had only just finished locking the hatch and resealing the interior when Casey's knife tap sounded against the porthole, sparking a renewed surge of hope. Locating the bell had been merely the first step in what would become an exhausting and technically demanding procedure for Casey. Working entirely alone in pitch darkness, without functioning lights on his own bell or reliable communications back to his surface team, he was forced to make multiple exhausting round trips between the Wildrake bell and his own, battling the constantly heaving ocean swells that shifted positions and orientations with every wave. The Stena welder above was being tossed about by the rough seas, making the entire underwater workspace unstable and unpredictable. Casey himself began to feel the creeping effects of near hypothermia as he struggled to secure the lift wire properly to the Wildrake bell. At 9:02 a.m., he checked on the trapped divers again through the porthole and observed increasingly frantic hand movements that conveyed their growing desperation. After several more laborious trips back and forth, the lift wire was finally connected at 10:10 a.m. The men inside remained alert, though they had now gone without any hot water for at least 5 hours and were exhibiting unmistakable early signs of hypothermia. At 11:40 a.m., the Wildrake's winch finally began turning in earnest. Within mere minutes, however, the bell became snagged on an obstruction on the seabed. In a moment of breathtaking recklessness, Masterson ordered the crane operator to shake the line back and forth violently and apply full power to the winch. The rest of the experienced deck crew watched in stunned disbelief. This was not how professional diving operations were conducted. Every action was supposed to be cautious, deliberate, meticulously checked and double-checked. Jerking aggressively on the only remaining lifeline without first repositioning the ship or sending down additional divers to assess the snag was an act of sheer impulsiveness. Their worst fears were realized moments later when a thunderous boom and a sharp snap echoed across the water. The lift wire had parted completely, going slack and dropping the bell back to the seafloor at 12:20 p.m. Inside the bell, Richard and Skip had felt the initial upward movement and experienced a powerful wave of relief and renewed hope. They had endured 8 long hours without any external heat by this point, and the cold had become a living, breathing torment that made every inhalation a labored effort. The metallic clank of the wire being attached had filled them with optimism, only for the unthinkable to happen. A loud, violent clash of metal brought the ascent to an abrupt halt, followed by the sickening thud of the wire breaking and the bell slamming back down onto the bottom. The realization that their ordeal was far from over-crushed whatever remaining strength they possessed. The Stina welder was urgently called back into action once more. Eddie Frank spent 30 grueling minutes searching before relocating the Wildrake bell, which was now wedged tightly between a section of pipe and the SALM base structure. At 1 p.m., he peered through the porthole and caught sight of Richard's ghostly white face. Richard was drawing hard, labored breaths, his eyes opening slowly as he registered the rescuer's presence. Skip lay curled up motionless on the floor of the bell, wrapped in his foil blanket. Before Frank could do anything further, the rough seas violently yanked him away via his own umbilical. By 3 p.m., after 9 exhausting hours in the water, the Stina divers were finally brought back to the surface for recovery. A fresh, rested diver was immediately dispatched at 5 p.m. When he reached the bell, he looked inside and was met with a heartbreaking sight. The two men were now slumped over each other on the floor, barely responsive after more than 13 hours without any hot water whatsoever. An almost superhuman display of endurance and willpower. Finally, at 7:30 that evening, the bell was successfully recovered and hoisted aboard the Wildrake. Despite the heroic efforts of dozens of individuals, divers risking their own lives in freezing, dark waters, deck crews working without rest, and support personnel coordinating under immense stress, the outcome was tragically irreversible. Richard Walker and Skip Gell had somehow survived without any external heat for at least 9 hours in conditions that would have felled most people far sooner, a testament to their training, mental fortitude, and sheer determination to live. Yet, the cumulative toll of prolonged hypothermia, exhaustion, oxygen deprivation under stress, and the unrelenting physical and psychological strain ultimately proved too much. In the months and years that followed, the international commercial diving community subjected every aspect of the incident to intense scrutiny. Brian Masterson should never have been personally directing the rescue operations. There were numerous highly qualified professionals on site with years of experience and pre-established emergency protocols who could have managed the situation far more effectively. His series of impulsive, compounding mistakes, combined with the ship's inherent design flaws, the hasty shortcuts taken during construction, and the failure to address known safety issues, directly cost 2 courageous men their lives. To add a final layer of insult to the tragedy, Masterson immediately began making arrangements to replace the damaged umbilical so that the 4 remaining saturated divers could be sent back down to finish the original contract. Those 4 men, however, refused and demanded to begin the full 5-day decompression process at once, prioritizing their own safety over the company's schedule. Legal proceedings dragged on for years. Lawsuits were filed against Infabco in both Scottish and United States courts, yet the company managed to evade any substantial consequences by successfully arguing in some jurisdictions that it was not the official employer of the divers. Eventually, a separate case in a UK court named 12 individuals as defendants, resulting in small financial settlements paid out to the grieving families. The Wildrake disaster endures as a powerful, sobering cautionary tale, a stark reminder of how a series of seemingly minor shortcuts, overlooked engineering flaws, and hubristic decisions in the high-stakes realm of commercial saturation diving can transform an ordinary night shift into a prolonged, nightmarish fight for survival beneath the crushing, indifferent waves of the North Sea. The story serves as an eternal memorial to the courage of those who descend into the depths and a call for unwavering vigilance in an industry where the margin for error is measured in inches and seconds.